Vincenti with a thought about what's going on in Malta at the moment. And today's subject is the pigeon cull. So in Birgu, the residents are up in arms. There's pigeon droppings falling out of the air like World War II and Luftwaffe bombs. And their cars, their clothes, their possessions, their hair probably is being affected by the pigeon carpet bombing that's taking place. As a result, of course, quite understandably, they're up in arms about this and have asked the government to intervene. And the council, it would seem, have then taken steps to begin a pigeon cull. But before you knew it, within a day and a half, people who love animals and love nature protested about this and gave reasonable arguments against the pigeon cull. Why should you kill pigeons when in actual fact they'll just come back in the same or greater numbers? Quite understandable. Now there are different types of people who see this problem from different types of angles. There's the indifferent, the person who will only get upset if it falls on their head or on their shirt, and then they just get on with it by complaining, but otherwise they're completely indifferent to pigeons. Then there are the other lot who live under the carpet bombing pigeons, and rightfully so, because they're being bombed by pigeon poo. And so it's a personal thing. Then there are the animal welfare, people who are concerned with animal welfare, who see all animals as sacred and with rights. And so these stand out and speak up in their defense. And then we have the pigeon fanciers, those who race their pigeons, who see pigeons as potential champions and sports pigeons, rather. So rather than just seeing them as nothing else but a meal or like a hunter, God forbid, I don't mean that you're shooting pigeons, hunters, even though when I used to have pigeons, and I raced pigeons for a while, it wasn't the first time that a pigeon came back with lead shot all over it. It made it back, but often it was useless after that, so it just went into the breeding cage. So, yep, there are different people who see pigeons in different ways. But what I found striking about the whole situation with pigeons was that within 24 hours of the animals' rights people stepping up for their cause, as is their right, in the defense of pigeons, then the government immediately intervened and showed that they had a meeting, they displayed some kind of concern, and they've taken a step back and stopped everything. So the pigeons will survive, much to the ire of the people in Birgu who now have still got a problem. So why do we react so instantly, with such a determined attitude when it comes to protecting what some people see as a pest, as a flying rodent, a pigeon? Why do we react? Why does the government react so positively to NGOs and people who speak up in favor of animal rights? But when we talk about the human embryo in IVF, all of a sudden you and me become less than a pigeon. All of a sudden we are disposable commodities which could be considered as becoming, if you like, spare parts or excess human embryos through embryo freezing. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the government is about to attempt to do this a second time without a mandate, though it wouldn't surprise me, and of course they would have a bit of a fight on their hands, because I know and you know that the vast majority of Maltese people do value life from conception, and the last thing that we want is a case where we create multiple excess embryos, % of which always die when they're being thawed before they're placed into the womb of the patient mother. So another form of abortion, basically just by a different name. We don't want this. The majority of people don't want this. We do want people to have access to IVF and have children. Yeah, it's an understandable situation. Wanting to have a child is a very natural need. But having the right to a child, having the right to create a child and excess children in case the child that you implant doesn't make it, and then having the right to say that the ones that are frozen are just left there in the freezer and we can close our eyes and ignore them and imagine they don't exist anymore, is completely wrong. And that's just repeating history over and over again. We've seen this before with the slaves, which became non-persons, and we treated so terribly in the 1800s in the States, where a plantation owner could own a slave and kill a slave, and it was completely legal for the plantation owner to do that because they were just possessions. We saw World War II with Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, and all these other concentration camps where Jews, Roma, homosexuals, people with disability were treated as lesser human beings. Even laws passed in Germany that consider Jews to be non-persons. And so are we going to repeat the same problem? Why do we lose focus? Why do we emotionally connect with a pigeon, but we completely undermine our own dignity as human beings and shoot ourselves in the foot and say, oh, well, a human embryo is just simply not alive yet? Why do we get to change our time-tested, truthful, scientifically proven ethical values because we feel, this is why we do it, because we feel it's an acceptable loss because the parent might want to have children? The problem I have with this is, first of all, it's never an acceptable loss. No parent wants to go through IVF knowing that they killed other children or allowed other children to die or froze other children and they remain frozen and then have a perfectly normal relationship with the children after that process, knowing that they had to go through such a draconian and completely reprehensible process. Thankfully in Malta, this doesn't happen. Thankfully in Malta, we have vitrification, which has the same, if not better, success rates than embryo freezing. And so vitrification is when we freeze the egg, and the egg is frozen and kept in storage and only used when it's needed. Embryo freezing is when you get the sperm and the egg together, create a human life, and freeze it, and then use those when you need them. So what's going to happen to all the excess embryos? Nobody has an answer. In fact, nobody across the world has found a solution. I lie. The Australians recently found a solution. They are turning off the machines of these thousands of human embryos left over after IVF because they legalized embryo freezing and not, as we did in Malta, vitrification. And when they turn them off, those little embryos are then grabbed and placed into costume jewelry so that the parents, the biological parents, can then wear their dead embryos in their bracelets, in their watches, in their jewelry, in their necklaces and rings. That sounds terribly similar to what I saw in Auschwitz recently, a couple of weeks ago, when I was there visiting the death camp, where Jews were then used as fuel. Their skin was used as fuel. Their skin was also used as lampshades and leather. The fat from their skin of the ones who were killed when they first arrived and still had some fat on them. And so they became mass-produced spare parts and commodities. And we're doing the same thing again across the world. And this just fascinates me that here in Malta, we see all this going around around us. We see these massive ethical problems. Yet here in Malta, we may be on the cusp again of trying to legalize, without an electoral mandate, to legalize embryo freezing by grabbing the Embryo Protection Act as it's known today, breaking it apart, calling it not the Embryo Protection Act, but possibly the IVF Act, so that the terminology, the actual name, does not give the wrong impression that we're actually protecting the embryo, so that we can freeze embryos and maybe give these spare embryos away to people who may want them, people who may be heterosexual or even homosexual couples. And many people will lose their values and ethics and their reasoning of the long-term ramifications on all of society, on us repeating the horrors of the past, only that we can't see them, just like the people outside Auschwitz who lived in the town nearby didn't know what was going on. And when the Americans arrived and they took them into Auschwitz to see what was going on, they were filled with shame and regret, and they cried, and some vomited and were sick. But the Americans got the actual Polish people living next door who never spoke up to grab these patients and to help give them some dignity and bury them. These dead, thousands and thousands of dead Jews, Roma, homosexuals, people with a disability, people who just basically were, to the German race, not human. So good luck if you're a pigeon. You know, you've got some people defending you, and it looks like the government's listening to the people defending you. But can we hope in Malta that the defense of human life will receive the same enthusiasm? And can we hope in Malta that we are mature enough, developed enough, and progressive enough to realize that history repeats itself? And so I believe our members of parliament who say they're all pro-life, both parties declared it, in fact all three parties who have been elected, all declared they are pro-life, then none of those MPs can usurp their power to then change their mind and tell you, but in this case it's okay not to be pro-life. Even though 35% to 35 out of 10, almost 4 out of every 10 or 35 out of every 100 die in the process, it's okay because we might improve the success rate. Because there are people who want to adopt unclaimed embryos and become parents because they can't, because maybe they're sterile and don't want to do IVF, or because the nature of the relationship, being homosexual, means they can't have children without embryo freezing. So whatever the case is, you know, you can have your different opinions, you can look at this from different points of view, but, you know, I think human life defends more protection and dignity and importance and urgency than a pigeon. No offense to you pigeons out there. Thank you.